Hi everyone. Welcome to my stories. No voiceovers, no dialogues, just moments, and what they make you feel. Today's story begins with a quiet garden, a bowl of leftover rice, and a guilt that no one dares to say aloud. She planted beans. He brought yogurt, and someone came back to return what was never his. No loud drama, no angry words, just silence and choices. The soft morning light cast a golden sheen across the small garden. Everything was still, save for the wind brushing gently through the leaves. Tu Tieu crouched over a bed of young amaranth, her slender hands carefully plucking each stubborn weed. Her face showed no clear emotion, but her eyes carried a quiet serenity, touched with a subtle weight. The lush green rose mirrored the silent persistence she had poured into this space, tending, nurturing, alone. She stood slowly, scanning the modest plot. The bean plants had grown taller, their climbing stems stretching upward, searching for something to grasp. She paused. No words, no exclamations, just a shift in breath, a flicker in her gaze. The realization was clear. They needed support, something to hold on to. Her decision came swiftly, not in speech, but through motion. She rolled up her sleeves, gathered her tools, and turned her gaze to the distant grove, where wild bamboo stood tall and waiting. In that moment, the peace surrounding her wasn't a conclusion. It was the calm before something unnamed. The vines weren't just reaching for a trellis, they were echoing her own quiet yearning for stability, for direction. The garden's silence was deceptive. Beneath it, something stirred. Change, perhaps, or revelation. Tu Tieu did not speak. She didn't need to. Her steps, deliberate and solitary, carried her toward what came next. The garden behind her shimmered gently under the rising sun, unaware it had just been left by a woman ready for more than routine. The day had begun not just with work, but with quiet resolve. In a quiet, well-lit office, the afternoon sun angled through tall windows, brushing against Mrs. Lan's weary face. She sat still, her composure refined but strained. Across the desk, the man she trusted most waited in silence. Between them lay more than conversation. It was a silent reckoning of trust, responsibility, and the weight of choices made too late. She adjusted the cup before her, not out of thirst, but hesitation. Her eyes, though steady, betrayed the turmoil she carried. And then, without flourish, without pretense, she made it known. She wanted to hand over control of the company. Not because she was tired, but because she had to leave. Yuri, her only remaining family, needed help. Real help. His illness had become unpredictable. At times, Yuri remembered everything. At others, he was lost in fog. She had tried everything. Doctors, treatments, consultations, but nothing stayed. Nothing worked. Now she planned to take him abroad, to seek the last hope medicine might offer. The man listened. No interruption, no doubt. Then a nod, slow and sure. He offered more than agreement. He offered a lifeline. He knew a specialist. He would handle things here. His calm steadied her for a moment. But as light shifted beyond the glass, so did her face. Behind the resolve was fear. She wasn't afraid of stepping away from the business. She wasn't afraid of starting over. What she feared, deeply, privately, was losing Huri. And perhaps in seeking to save him, she already felt herself slipping into a place where even control couldn't follow. The deal wasn't about business anymore. It was a mother's quiet surrender. The forest path stretched quiet and narrow, flanked by weeds and scattered stones. Tu Tieu walked alone, a small machete in hand, her steps measured beneath the glare of the midday sun. Sweat beaded on her brow, slipping down her cheek, yet her gaze stayed focused. Each footfall felt deliberate, sinking into the rhythm of the life she had carved for herself. Silent, steady, enduring. No complaints, no sighs, only the sharp sound of blade against bamboo echoing through the trees. She chose each stalk with care, cutting them to the right length, stacking them neatly into tight bundles. Her calloused hands moved with quiet precision, treating even the simplest task with reverence. The heat thickened, pressing down like a heavy blanket, but she did not pause. With every cut, every bundle, she seemed to be building more than just a trellis. She was reinforcing something deeper: structure, purpose, resilience. Meanwhile, back home, the quiet did not last. A figure crept into her modest kitchen, his steps hesitant, eyes scanning the shelves with a mix of hunger and guilt. The rice pot, the braised fish, a stolen meal, simple yet heavy with consequence. He ate in silence, unaware that with each bite he unraveled something fragile. Trust, perhaps, or dignity. And Tu Tieu, still deep in the forest, unaware of the breach, hoisted the final bundle onto her shoulder. The home she left was no longer the same. Something had shifted, and by the time she returned, the silence that greeted her would carry a weight she had not prepared for. The afternoon sun slanted through the open window, casting pale gold across the cold, empty floor. Tu Tieu returned, her back damp with sweat, bamboo bundles pressing against her shoulders. She set them down by the doorstep, wiping her brow. The house felt oddly silent. No breeze, no familiar bird call. She turned toward the kitchen, the rice pot, its lid shifted, the braised fish clearly disturbed, a chair slightly out of place. Small signs, but they whispered something was wrong. She stepped softly through the inner room. No one, no footprints, no mess. Yet the kitchen held a scent that didn't belong. Not food, but presence. A presence that hadn't been invited. Tu Tieu stood still, listening. Her heart quickened. Not with fear, but with the unshakable sense that something had unfolded here while she was away. She scanned the space once more, then reached for her phone. The call was brief, but her expression carried the weight of something unspoken. On the other end, Uri. His voice came through clearly, grounding the silence. Tu Tieu said only a few words, but between them stretched a shared understanding of risk, of instinct, of trust. Uri would come, she was certain. When she hung up, her gaze lingered on the empty bowl left on the table. A silent question drifted through her. Who had been here? And why? Beneath the calm exterior of the room, a ripple had formed. Something invisible, yet undeniable. The house had been breached, and with it, her sense of quiet was no longer intact. Dusk settled swiftly over the forested hills. A cold breeze swept across the stone steps as the low hum of a motorbike came to a halt at the gate. Uri stepped off, eyes scanning the quiet surroundings before resting on Tu Tieu, standing beneath the weathered wooden beam. No greetings, no explanations. The glance they exchanged said everything. They entered the kitchen together. Uri bent over the empty bowl, lifted the rice pot's lid, and inspected the back door for footprints. Each movement was unhurried, precise, as if he were rereading a page that had been torn midway. His face remained unreadable, but within, a practiced instinct stirred quietly. Then he paused. A small crumpled scrap of paper peeked from beneath the tablecloth. Uri reached down, unfolding it carefully. Just an old note, scribbled in clumsy handwriting. He studied it for a long moment, then turned to Tu Tieu. No words were spoken, but the air between them thickened with tension. Tu Tieu clenched her hands. Something was taking shape. Not a vague suspicion anymore, but a chain of real events. Uri placed the note down slowly, a silent confirmation between them. The question that had lingered was now partially answered. But that answer was not the end. Instead, it cracked open a deeper mystery, one that made the ground beneath them feel less certain, and the quiet of the kitchen suddenly fragile. Truth had entered, but with it came the weight of knowing, and the fear of what knowing might bring next. Shadows lengthened across the porch as the gate to Uri's home creaked open. Alan stepped in slowly, each step heavy with a truth long kept. He didn't glance around, his eyes fixed straight ahead, on Uri, who sat beneath the bougainvillea trellis, still as though he'd been waiting. Between them was space, filled not with distance, but with unspoken weight. Alan stopped, bowed his head, and clenched his fists by his sides. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, worn cloth bundle, tied with rough twine. He didn't open it, just placed it gently on the tile floor. That was enough. The truth was there, solid, irrefutable. From inside, Mrs. Lan stepped out quietly. Her eyes moved from Alan to Uri, steady and unflinching. She didn't deny, didn't defend. In a voice low and dry, she recounted what had happened that day, how Alan had collapsed, how hunger and desperation had battled inside her. No excuses, just a blunt, brittle truth. Uri looked up. His gaze wasn't cold, nor was it forgiving. It was the look of someone who had just lost something unnamed, perhaps trust, or faith in what people choose when no one is watching. He nodded once, a gesture not of approval, but of closure. The wind stirred, carrying away what remained unsaid. In the stillness that followed, forgiveness drifted in. Not whole, not complete, but enough. A beginning, perhaps. Born from the wreckage of truth, finally spoken aloud. A quiet morning. Thin mist hung over the freshly rebuilt beam trellis. Everything was damp with dew, from the newly planted bamboo stakes to the twine stretching upward toward the pale sky. The bean shoots reached out, silent but resilient, as if they had never known collapse. Tu Tieu stepped out from the small house. Her hands still held traces of soil. She paused beneath the trellis, her eyes resting on the soft green leaves, thoughtful and calm. Slowly she knelt, adjusting a loose strand of string. Each motion was unhurried, tender, as though tending to something fragile and deeply cherished. A breeze passed through, no longer heavy with silence, but carrying the scent of fresh grass, damp earth, and new beginnings. Uri appeared behind her, a coil of twine in hand. No words were exchanged, just a glance. It was enough. Together, they tied a few more lines, drove a few more stakes into the ground. The air remained still, broken only by the subtle rhythm of two people who had weathered more than they could name. From a distance, Mrs. Lan watched quietly, arms cradling a bundle of freshly picked greens. Alan stepped out carrying water. He placed it down without a word, then stepped back. And when the first light of sun touched the trellis, everything, the plants, the people, the memories, seemed to rise. No one wept, no one smiled, but something had shifted. Peace hadn't come from stillness, but from wounds allowed to heal.